This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Shawn Maestretti of Studio Petrichor, a design studio working out of California. Shawn's personal mission is to reconnect with the natural world, tread lightly on the land, nurture biodiversity, protect water and bring people together. We speak about how Studio Petrichor designs with these values in mind and the systems and techniques that are used to achieve these goals. Shawn begins by talking about his own background and journey into the world of ecologically integrated gardens.
So I'm a landscape architect and designer, and really a whole lot more. Landscape architect is a great title to have, but if we were to sum it up into one thing, I think I would consider myself a disruptor. Our design firm, Studio Petrichor, we focus on a more regenerative approach to not only design, but implementation and ongoing land care, and our clients' and communities' relationships to the land and waters. We delve into education, into workshops, presentations, currently co-authoring a book with some of my team, which is an exciting process. We just submitted our first book proposal to an agent, which is exciting. We started a nonprofit dedicated to bringing communities together to learn and take what they've learned home. And, I'm originally from Reno, Nevada, but I've lived here in Los Angeles since I was 19, so a better part of 25 years. So you could say that I'm a native Los Angeles.
That's interesting. So you work in both public and private spaces, is that correct?
Yeah, mostly in private. Most of our clients are residential. And with a focus on residential, we consider all of our individual parcels, if you will, to have so much potential in the urban context. Just like the seas are a multitude of droplets, our cities are a multitude of parcels. And together there's an ocean of possibility when reconnecting watersheds to the larger water cycle. And we work on some public projects with Pasadena Water and Power right now, and furthering our work with public agencies to educate and empower communities to honor and protect life and living systems.
Fantastic. So I'm assuming water is of quite a significance in your area. Can you talk about how that could be managed in a garden setting?
Water's life, right? And our focus on water, and in our name, Petrichor, Studio Petrichor. Petrichor is that scent of rain after a long dry period, which we have many long dry periods here in Southern California. Sometimes there's 9 months without any rain. And we are in a very dry region. Southern California is, the driest. So our focus is on water. But really our focus is, even though it's on water, it really comes down to soil and how we can optimize soil for optimizing and maximizing absorption and infiltration to support the native plant communities that we are so passionate about.
I remember listening to a podcast a while ago, and I don't know if I've got this correct, but is there an issue with who owns water that falls on a property in your area?
I've heard a lot about that, and I have yet to experience that. We're looking at our communities to really find their agency and autonomy in harvesting their water. And in certain situations, it's difficult to do that. We might be in an area that's prone to landslide or liquefaction. So harvesting water and putting it back in the ground may not be feasible on all properties, but the simple act of leaving a log in the landscape or mulching and really treating the soil and honoring the soil as a potential sponge is a great way to start.
And do you find that you deal with clients who maybe have more of a traditional view of what a garden should look like, or, maybe even a slightly unenvironmentally sound view of what a garden should look like? I'm thinking, people kind of, even in the UK, are quite keen on lawns, and they're not always the best way of dealing with water or with soil. Or do you find that the clients that you get are already fairly clued up?
Yeah, there's a current mindset, what we consider the status quo or the current paradigm, where landscapes have been controlled and manipulated. I mean, design is a word that really means manipulation and control. And we love what we see from other parts of the world. And and want that for here. And there's a cost to that. It takes a lot more resources and inputs to keep a lot of those plants alive. And our focus is on mostly California native gardens for many reasons, supporting biodiversity, habitat, or water conservation, and so on. We really focus on appreciating our local plants, local plant communities, and bring them into the work. Now, when it comes to alignment, which is another word we focus a lot on, is how do we attract clients who are aligned with our ethos? And over the past few years, we've been able to really nail that down and attract the clients that are a little bit less interested in how the garden's going to look, even though it's there. Their interest is really in harvesting water, supporting soil biology, supporting the native plant communities, which help support biodiversity and habitat, native pollinators, and the food chain, really. And in turn, that helps to conserve water and optimize it.
So am I right in thinking, obviously you don't have that much rain, so when it does rain, does it tend to be kind of downpours and then the risk of flooding, maybe?
Yeah, especially right now. We've had some floods around California for sure. It's raining right now outside, and it just brings joy to my heart to know that my garden is soaking all of that in. All of it's being collected from the rooftops from both my neighbor's house and our office, and heading out to a rain garden in the back, which is really exciting. So to know that that's possible for anywhere, really, it really is a beautiful mindset shift in focusing on water first.
So what are some of the techniques that you use? I mean, I think people might assume that it's kind of plants, and more plants. And as you said, with the focus on native plants, are there other things that you can do to A, harvest water, and B, stop it basically leaving your property?
If there's one thing that Studio Petrichor is known for, it's our approach to hugelkultur. And I'm not sure if many of your listeners probably are familiar with it. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
My partner, Lee Adams, really turned me on to hugelkultur about 5 years ago. And it's been a process of really understanding the simple technique of keeping green waste on site and logs from fell trees from around the community, bringing them to a site and creating these wonderful landforms in the landscape that make the landscape look even more interesting. And those logs and that mulch and the optimization of that soil help to absorb all that water. And we pair those with rain gardens wherever we can too, to harvest that water, soaking that up. And what we come to see is that there's a collateral advantage to optimizing the soil through hugelkultur and all of those related techniques, which we have branded as the carbon culture. Where there's carbon in the soil, there's water. And where there's water in the soil, there's life.
Yeah, I love that idea of making the garden a closed cycle and kind of keeping what would be traditionally classed as waste products on site. Obviously, your goal is to roll this out and encourage people to adopt this mindset. If you manage to get people on board with this whole way of gardening, can it actually, in the bigger picture, can it change the landscape around you?
It is changing the landscape, absolutely. And I've come to understand these systems as self-complicating systems. At Studio Petrichor, we focus on the variability and the messy nature of nature, right? And these materials that are freely given to us from the abundance of nature, such as, fell trees, all of our garden clippings, prunings, and the existing soil that we have on site are the raw ingredients to a recipe that complicates itself and becomes a living system. So our focus is really on whole systems gardens. We have redefined form follows function. And, form follows function historically is defined as the shape of a building, an object, or space primarily related to its intended function or purpose. So we ask ourselves, what is the function we are relating our designs to meet the needs or desires of human activity? Is it purely an aesthetic ideal? And we consider the function of the land first with water, and water that flows onto our property, even off of the streets. If we can pull that off of the street and move it through our property, that's free water that can be absorbed in the soil. And all of those raw materials coming together develop their own life force.
So when you survey a site, are you considering a garden as part of the wider landscape.
Absolutely. Watersheds, pollinators, wildlife, they don't adhere to these geopolitical property line boundaries. And that's why I mentioned earlier that our parcels together could be connected whole systems if we really focused on that.
And is it tough to sell that aesthetic to some people?
Yeah, I mean, there was a period where I was trying to quote unquote sell sustainability, which was really difficult. And until we really got out there and focused on trying and failing and trying again and discovering what works, through that process, we become more confident in our approach. And others start to see this. They start to see this interesting, new, yet very ancient method, if you will, and they're attracted to it, not purely because of a visual or aesthetic ideal, but really it's a feeling. Whenever we hold one of our hugelkultur workshops, which we do many of, or hands-on workshops, when people get their hands in the soil and start placing logs and piecing it together, a common thread that comes through that is they say, this just feels right. So there's an energetic vibrational match, if you will, to what happens at our workshops. The same thing occurs when marketing this, if you will. By the time a client gets to a consultation with me and they've gone through the questions with our administrator, Laura here, there's already a 50% vibrational match. And I know that sounds kind of corny, but it's true. And they're interested in doing this because they know it feels right.
Yeah, I think there is a really deep kind of human connection to gardens that do embrace nature. And I totally understand what you're saying. Thinking about hugelkultur, it is a technique I would associate maybe more with what we might call in the UK forest gardening. And the focus with that would be, yes, it would be on wildlife, but it might also be on edibles. Is that something you include in your garden?
Yeah, out here in Southern California, it gets really hot and dry in the summer, and I tried a hugelkultur berm myself in my garden to grow food, and I noticed that it required more inputs during the summer to keep food plants that needed more water, especially in our hot summers. It took a lot more inputs to keep them alive. So we took different approaches by, in raised planters, we would take green waste materials and put them at the bottom of those raised planters, and they would hold on to water more. And we've had success in growing food that way. This is my journey at discovery of hugelkultur. I've seen how just that little bit of water that these logs can harvest throughout the year, even through temperature differential, just a little bit of moisture collecting on the logs, even on a hot summer day and early in the morning, is enough to help sustain a native landscape. And I've really put my garden to the test here, and our clients' gardens, by after 2 or 3 years of establishment, being able to turn the water off for at least a month at a time.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously does make a massive difference. And how about the wildlife in these gardens? Do you see that increasing?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The amount of birds and insects, lizards, and so on that show up in these natural gardens is quite astounding.
And do the clients embrace that as well? I mean, some people can be, I think, a little nervous of letting too much wildlife into their gardens, but do they gain a new appreciation for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the unfortunately most vilified little creature here in Southern California is the gopher. And I even went through my process coming to understand who a gopher is and what their role is. They're part of the soil food web. They are indigenous to this land, and yet the most vilified little creature. And they're helping to increase absorption and drainage. And yeah, they might mess with some of the non-native species and eat those tender wildflowers, but they don't seem to mess with the native shrubs and perennials as much as they do with those yummy tender plants. And that's been one of the biggest hurdles for many of our clients, is to embrace all life. We tend to cherry pick what we love, and if you love life, you start to embrace all life. And they really appreciate it because we co-create gardens where our clients are pulled into the garden through some of the pathways that we create within these mounds. And it really is a moment to bring out your cup of coffee in the morning and saunter through the garden and maybe pull a few weeds that you've become familiar with and really interact and develop a relationship with the garden. And that's our end goal for our clients, is them in relationship with their gardens.
I mean, I think when people develop that relationship, they automatically become more invested in the space as well. And I think we'll come more onto the education side. But I was thinking as well about, you mentioned native plants. You presumably find those more resilient. Do you have a kind of ratio of native to non-native plants that you include in gardens, or do you favour natives?
I love to at least focus on 50 to 75% keystone species, species that are local to, say, we have a great website, calscape.org, that we use, that we can type in a zip code to any of our clients' properties and find out what was native or what is native to that zip code. And if we can get at least 50 to 75% of those plants in there, there's room to wiggle in some other native plants from other regions of California and then other plants from other Mediterranean climates. But if our goal is to reduce the water, the supplemental water down to, say one time a month, a nice deep watering once a month, can those non-native species also adapt to that and grow with that? And I've found that they can.
So again, you mentioned the kind of soil and trying to improve it or to make it more resilient. How do you see soil changing in these gardens? Is there something that you tend to start with, and then do you see more organic matter coming in, for instance, or more soil life? How does it change?
Great question. I'm going to use my garden as an example up here in Altadena. We started with really hydrophobic soil, really dry, sandy loam soil that repelled water. And another carbon culture practice we employ is lasagna mulching, taking cardboard out of the waste stream, laying that down and covering it up with mulch. And over time, all of the plant prunings, if you will, all of the old sunflowers or the amaranth from the previous year in late summer, when I cut those down, I get my 6-year-old out there with his pruners and we chop and drop. And nothing leaves in the green waste bin. We don't send any of our green waste away here at home. And we're encouraging that in these practices with all of our clients and our communities, to see what you can do by just leaving that mulch there. It may not be the prettiest mulch, but right now, all of that mulch is sprouting with the next round of wildflower seeds and holding on to all of that moisture, right? And last year, I had to do a little bit of trenching to adjust an irrigation line. And what I uncovered was the tree roots, from the oak tree to the pepper tree that were here before we got here. All of those roots were connecting, and we could see a horizon of deep, rich, humic-rich soil that went down about 4 inches. So yes, the answer is it absolutely has been changing the soil profile.
That's interesting. And actually, that sparked me to think, when you change the soil profile like that, and again, I kind of garden that way myself. So when I dig down, I can see a strong layer of organic matter and rich soil. Does that then change the structure of the garden, or more the types of plants that you can put in the garden? And if you start with one set of plants, do you then need to ensure your plants kind of can evolve to adapt to that soil? Because I guess the landscape really is changing, isn't it?
Yeah. Like I said, we focus on mostly native plants, and each year I try something different. I mean, I consider my garden our laboratory so that we can test what might work for others with similar conditions to ours, right? And I do sometimes go to some of those specialty nurseries and grab some of those Mediterranean plants that are really interesting, and I'll put them in, and they seem to be doing well, even though I have cut down the water to minimal supplemental water.
So are there any kind of key projects that you've worked on that you really hold up as successes?
Well, any of our clients that have asked to go on this journey with us, their gardens have transformed not only them, but their community. And it's really funny to see how, after we built these massive mounds and completely transformed what was once a water-thirsty lawn into a sensual, curvaceous garden, their neighbors walk by with these odd looks on their faces, wondering what the heck is happening. And then 3 years later, there's this abundant growth. And the garden is full of these native plants that are diverse in the number of species we've included. And it has changed the perception around this, so much so that Pasadena Water and Power has asked us to do some demonstration projects, and especially a design for a large 1 acre median section where we can harvest water off of the road. And we did a schematic design for that. And we're in the process of working out the rest of that design so we can get that going.
A lot of the techniques you're mentioning involve, well, time really, and there has to be a level of informed management as the garden evolves. How do you sustain that relationship with clients? Do you go into it saying, look, this is going to be a long-term relationship and we're going to work together for a number of years?
Yeah, this has been on my mind for a while now. I'll go into the relationship with that information and remind them of this throughout the relationship. And it has inspired me to create what we're going to, I think, title an integration process post-construction. Sometimes clients are left with this mulchy, what some might consider be a mess, and wondering what's going to happen. And we are beginning to focus on how can we support their relationship in the first year, second year, third year, until they know what to do. How cool would it be if our clients became the irrigation controller rather than the irrigation controller being set for 1 to 2 times a week, them going out and knowing when the last watering was, or being able to just kind of brush away some mulch or see how the plants are doing and know when to run the irrigation system on an as needed basis. That would be a monumental shift in how things are done.
It would. And I think that some designers find that they may have clients. Basically, if you can afford to have a garden designer and you can afford to have like a garden revamp or redesign, you may be just a very, very busy person who works a lot. Do you find that there's sometimes time constraints on your clients if you're asking them to become involved in their garden, to actually work in it? Do you sometimes face resistance on that front?
Not so much resistance. At the beginning of the design project, we get a sense of what they're able to do at that time and moment. But just as a garden changes, our lives change and our relationships change. So our mindset at the beginning of the project is going to be completely different 3 years down the road. And our hope is that they, over time, really start to gain some independence and autonomy and agency within their garden spaces, and a desire to really be involved with it. And we're seeing that happen. We're absolutely seeing that happen. And then when we do have clients that you can just tell they're not going to take the time to do it. So we've engaged another group, Saturate. They're a maintenance company, and they're very forward thinking, and their focus is on these dry gardens. And they're there to support these clients in what they need.
I love that. It's such a responsible way of working, not to just hand over a garden to somebody and kind of say, okay, well, I've done my job and you know, now it's yours to look after. So that's a really, really positive thing. In terms of American garden design in general, are you doing something unusual or revolutionary?
Yeah, it is revolutionary in terms of, challenging the status quo and disrupting the status quo. That is what I would consider revolutionary. This information or this intelligence that we're tapping into is, as old as the planet itself, right? And it's really about listening to and tapping into these living systems and acknowledging them first before our desires and needs, right? I think about my journey to date in furthering my understanding of the world and what we refer to as self-complicating systems, as I mentioned earlier, has led me to go deep within myself to begin my personal healing journey. So spiritually, consciousness and awareness are integral to our reconnection with the living world and living systems of which we're all part and particle. There is no evolution without involution, and humanity is the catalyst to a regenerative feedback loop. When we can reconnect with the living systems from which we all exist and begin to see how we impact these systems, we begin to see how powerful we are. we have the power to destroy just as we have the power to co-create. And this applies to the community member just as much as it applies to the landscape designer or the city planner. A focus on the functions, on organic life, the hydrologic cycle, and the energy cycle will support our awareness around whether or not an action or an idea is potentially extractive or supportive to life.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think that, we are all coming around more to that way of thinking. If people wanted to find out more about your work, I think you're very inspirational, and I think a lot of people could learn a lot, not just garden owners, but professionals as well, from the way that you do operate. Where can people find out more?
Sure. Studio-Petrichor.com. We just started a new website, which was really exciting to work with this branding company, the Good Alliance. And they have created an excellent website that's still, in its becoming. And you can sign up for our newsletter. We have great content that's coming out. For those local to California or those who want to get involved, we have hands-on workshops to learn how to do this yourself. And we are in the process of dreaming up an online design course to help educate around Whole Systems Gardens, our nonprofit, which can be found through our website as well. We do a lot of free first Thursday night webinars with different professionals, similar to a podcast, and bring people together and educate communities, empower them to honor and protect these natural living systems. So the website's one great way to get to us. And on Instagram and TikTok's newer, doing some fun videos there. The address for that is at _studio_Petrichor. Those are great ways to see what we're doing.
A very big thank you to Shawn for talking to me about his work and about Studio Petrichor. I hope you will go and check out their really interesting and innovative stuff. And thanks to you for listening. Now here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about a marker of spring. Have you seen one yet?
Each year, we have a choice for when we might celebrate the arrival of spring. Whether it's the regimented meteorological format, where spring starts on the 1st of March and ends on the 31st of May, or the astronomical system, when it begins at the spring equinox around the 20th of March and ends at the summer solstice around the 21st of June. However, I'm fairly sure that most of us who love the outdoor life, the plants, and the wildlife that they sustain, will have our own way of deciding when spring has finally arrived. Whether it's the sight of a particular flower, the sound of a garden songbird, or maybe it's just that smell of freshness in the air as leaf buds begin to open. But for me, with my lifelong love of the bug world, it has to be when I see the orange tip butterflies on the wing. Because these delicate little creatures are uniquely dependent on the environmental conditions of spring for undertaking and completing the active part of their life cycle. And it begins each year when the climatical conditions of spring signal to the orange tips that winter is over and that it's now time for them to hatch from their chrysalises. And as they break free and take to the air, these small white harbingers of spring, with their mottled green hindwings, are unmistakable, especially the males, with bright orange tips to their wings. But as they flutter along hedgerows and across our gardens, searching for mates and nectar-rich flowers to feed from, they'll also be finding the cruciferous wildflowers, such as hedge garlic and cuckoo flower, that the females will lay their eggs on, and where their caterpillars will feed on the developing seed pods. Then, within just 3 to 4 weeks, and before the end of spring, all the adult butterflies will have died, whilst their caterpillars quickly mature before securing themselves with a silk girdle to the stem of their food plant and become a chrysalis, which then completes the active part of the orange tip's annual life cycle, all within the seasonal boundaries of spring. But it's now that the immobile part of the butterfly's life begins, remaining as a chrysalis for the next 10 months and hopefully avoiding the seasonal verge and hedge cutting, whilst it slowly undergoes the magical process called metamorphosis, where all the internal organs of the former caterpillar are broken down into a protein-rich soup that contains some very special cells called imaginal cells. Cells that begin replicating to create the structures and organs of the adult butterfly, which, for the orange tips, will be just in time to herald the arrival of spring the following year.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.